Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it very much. As the title says, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sports events industry in the United States and specifically talk about sports commissions and our organization, Greater Cleveland Sports Commission, and the effect that our work is having on our community. First and foremost, sporting events are huge business. In the U.S., you'll see some really significant numbers here that in 2021, sports travel event organizers and venues spent almost $92 billion. In sports travel alone in 2023, generated over $50 million, $52 billion in direct spending in the U.S. And there are thousands of sporting events, and they fall into a lot of different categories. You have a lot of events that are owned by nonprofit organizations or NGOs. In the U.S., Olympic governing bodies are not government, they are nonprofit organizations. Every Olympic sport, every Pan American sport hosts different events for their athletes as they compete. You've got organizations like the NCAA that governs collegiate sports in the United States, organizations like Amateur Athletic Union, that's the largest youth sports organization in the U.S., and many, many other nonprofit organizations that exist to coalesce sports, provide opportunities for people to compete in sports. And they all host events of various sizes. You also have a lot of privately owned businesses that host sporting events. It is, I would tell you, the rise in privately owned events over the past couple of decades in the United States has gone up dramatically. And quite frankly, it's because there's a lot of money to be had in hosting events. And this really doesn't take into account what I'm talking about, professional sports, meaning the professional sports leagues, other than when those leagues host major events. It is a highly, highly competitive business. It's back in the 1980s and into the 90s, there started to become a separation of sporting events as a subset of meetings and conventions. And what happened was the recognition that hosting of large sporting events took a very different set of skills by a community, a different set of venues. You started to have what are now proliferated throughout the United States and different parts of the world, what we call sports commissions. In fact, you'll hear from Charlie Leader from Indianapolis. He'll mention the Indiana Sports Corp. They were one of the very first in the United States and highly, highly successful. And I would argue that sporting events in a city like Indianapolis, a city in some ways very similar in size to Cleveland, has done a great deal to advance the economy and the image of Indianapolis. So you started back in 1992 as more of these sports commissions were starting to be created, a national association of sports commissions, now called Sports ETA, but it really started to coalesce as an industry. So you saw about 20 cities get together in 1992. Now the National Association has 850 members. The majority of those are cities from around the United States, of organizations that represent their cities to compete and host large regional, national, or international sporting events. They take different forms. You have some like Cleveland, which I'll talk to you a little bit about, that are larger, independent organizations. Some, in fact, the majority are small pieces of destination marketing organizations or tourism organizations, and other forms. There really is not a one-size-fits-all for these type of organizations in the U.S., but suffice it to say now, it is very much an industry. The hosting of major sporting events in the U.S. is a large and highly competitive industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization, the Greater Cleveland Sports Commission, just about how it formed 25 years ago and where the organization is today and what it means to our community. First, I'll tell you a little bit about our city, Cleveland. We are a city that's located on the Great Lakes in what's the Midwest of the United States. It's the population of the region, the MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area, is about 2.5 million. It's the 18th largest market in the United States. At one point, Cleveland was the 6th largest city in the United States, historically a major manufacturing hub in what's sort of used to be called, not so much anymore, the Rust Belt of the United States, where you had cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit that were really the manufacturing centers of the world at the time. And at one point, for a couple of decades, more patents per capita came out of Cleveland than any other city in America. It was a major innovation hub back about 100 years ago. And a city that, quite frankly, in the 70s, 1970s, 80s, and 90s, fell in a lot of hard times. As a lot of manufacturing plants closed, moved to other parts of the United States, other parts of the world. The population shrank, and for a couple of decades, Cleveland really struggled to figure out what its economy would be based on after being one of the major manufacturing hubs of the U.S. Currently, the city is doing well. It's back to growing. A strong focus on medical innovation. Still a major manufacturing hub, but now more advanced manufacturing, and still a major business center in the United States. It's also historically and now been a major sports city. It's a city that, quite frankly, sports plays an outsized role in its image, in its self-image, in its image out to the world. It is the smallest city in the United States to have a team in the largest 3 professional sports leagues, and the NFL, the NBA, and Major League Baseball. It's a city that, again, for better or worse, over-indexes on its image being tied to its sports teams. And it's a very deep-rooted community, multi-generational community, and an incredible amount of civic pride that is tied into its sports teams. And I would say sports is very much in the DNA, historically and today, of the community. Our organization started was formed in between 1999, opened up its doors in the first days of 2000. As more sporting events started to be hosted, you had the sports teams, civic leaders, government leaders, public sector leaders that got together with a desire to have a more concerted effort to make Cleveland a player in the hosting of major sporting events. Knowing that professional sports was something the community was very interested in, started to see cities like Indianapolis, like St. Louis, other cities in the United States, many our size, starting to have a lot of success and a feeling that Cleveland could do much the same. I'm not going to read word for word what our mission and vision is, but ultimately, our organization, which is a nonprofit and NGO, was formed to make Cleveland one of the best cities in our country for the hosting of major sporting events. You'll see when we were founded, very small organization. We had 2 staff members, a small board, a very small budget. And now here, 25 years later, we're actually one of the largest 3 or 4 sports commissions in the country. We have a regular staff of 18. Oftentimes we staff up significantly when we host major events, but day in and day out, year in and year out, we have a staff of 18 that is concentrated fully on attracting and helping to manage sporting events who come to our city. We have a large board of trustees who are all very financially and otherwise very supportive. It's business leaders, sports leaders, government leaders, media leaders. that see an incredibly strong value, and I'll get into why, in Cleveland being a leader in the United States in hosting major events, and they really put a lot of resource behind it. In our budget now, about $2.5 million a year. Oftentimes, that's for the organization. Oftentimes, our budget may be 3 or 4 times that, depending on the events we might be hosting that year, where dollars are needed to be raised. Although what I would tell you is the vast majority of events that we host don't take any dollars. We don't have to raise money to host. We go out, we win the rights over other cities to host those events, and the work the organization puts in is concentrated on making those events ideally more successful when hosted in our city than in any other city. Most of our funding comes privately. About 60% of our annual budget and the dollars that we raise when needed to host major events come from largely corporations who see the value back into the community. But there is also funding from, at times, from our city, from our county, from our state, and it's never guaranteed. We have to show an incredibly strong return on investment for those dollars. And what I'll talk about is, it is very different than what Brad talked about with professional sports. Our measures of success are outside dollars spent in our community that otherwise would not have been spent. That is our number one key metric, and really what we concentrate on. Since we were founded in 2000, we have hosted 260 sporting events. Actually, the number now is 263. We track it ongoing. And those are events that, but for our organization, would not have been hosted. Those are not professional sporting events. Those are individual sporting events that, if our organization did not exist, that we played either the sole role or the majority role in the attracting and or hosting of those events. And the direct spend economic impact of those events, actually with a couple of things we're about to be awarded, will be just over $1 billion. So what that means for us and to our stakeholders is that now about $1 billion of spending, largely from people coming into town. Occasionally it's from production and other dollars that were outside dollars spent in the community. The largest portion of this are visitor dollars that came in for the hosting of events that otherwise would not have been in Cleveland. This year in 2024, we hosted 20 events. It's actually a big year. Our average year is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 or so events. Right now for next year, we have 15 events, and every one of those are events where we play some role in the management or finances of that event as part of it having it come to our community. There are major events, and they're the ones that our community knows about. Just this year, we hosted the NCAA Women's Final Four, the National Collegiate Women's Basketball Championship, significant event in the United States. The Pan Am Masters Games, first time that event had been held in the United States. We had about 4,000 athletes and other 4,000 visitors from 79 countries. A lot of major events, but quite frankly, the vast majority of the events that we host are ones that are not in the media. They might be a large youth volleyball tournament, the World Yo-Yo Championship. I can go on and on with events that maybe are not going to get the average person all that excited, but at the end of the day, they bring a lot of people and a lot of dollars to our community. What we base the success of our organization is we try to provide, our goal is that we provide more service to the event's rights holder, the people that own those events, we believe, than just about any other city in the United States. And part of that is, as I mentioned, these are highly competitive events to win. From the smallest to the largest event, we are usually competing against 6, 8, 10, sometimes 20 different cities. And oftentimes the biggest events sometimes have a smaller number of cities because they're harder to put on, they're more expensive to put on. And we are at one level competing to make sure that our city, a city that we love, that we're very passionate about, is chosen over other cities around the region, around the country, sometimes around the world. But where we feel we can create a competitive advantage is that we can provide these types of services by our team and by our board and our community at no cost to the event's rights holder, so that we have the ability to try and make their event more successful in our city than anywhere else. And what I will tell you is, by almost every measure within our industry, and you could talk about the number of events, the size, the scale, the economic impact, and that economic impact is focused on direct spend. Cleveland, for the past 10 years or more, consistently is one of the top handful of cities in the United States for the hosting of those events. The other thing that is very important for us beyond direct spending is Cleveland is a city that, because of the difficult times that we had in the 1970s and 1980s, cities in our region in particular have battled perception issues, seen as older industrial cities. In fact, that's not the case anymore, but perceptions are hard to change. We have a lot of research on showing that, when people see our community on national, oftentimes international media, but we really focus more on U.S., it absolutely changes their perception of what Cleveland is. More importantly, we know that when we have events that bring in 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people, we have lots of research that shows the perception of people who have visited Cleveland is significantly higher than those who have never visited. And we know that from other research that we do, that leads more people to highly consider our city as a place to live, as a place to work, as a place to invest, as a great talent attractor. And so there also is a significant benefit in hosting these events by getting tens of thousands of new people each year, sometimes hundreds of thousands, to see our city in a different light than they may have otherwise seen them. And as you see, some of these major events have very significant economic impacts, but also are seen at times by tens and tens of millions of others through direct media. It's also important for us that we utilize sporting events as a platform for other community change. And we learned a long time ago, we hosted an event in 2004 called the International Children's Games. It's sort of the world's youth Olympics. It was started back in the 1960s, and we were the first ever U.S. host city. And what we learned there was a high value, and the community absolutely rallied around that event, around the cause of youth and internationalism. And it really taught us a lesson that for specific events, we really have an opportunity, because sports is so powerful, and certain sporting events are so powerful, that we could use the hosting of sporting events as a tool to advance other community priorities. And we've really made a focus on using certain sporting events as an opportunity for underserved youth within our community. Oftentimes, many events that we have we will create programs where that provide youth opportunities, not only to take part, to meet elite athletes, but ultimately to enhance all of our city's rec centers with new equipment and programming that lasts for many, many years after those events. And what we do is, years in advance, we look at the slate of events that we have coming to our community. We meet with our city's rec centers, and we determine where are the opportunities to use those events as a platform for huge community change. What I will say lastly is a couple of closing comments. The challenges we see in our industry, one, it's highly competitive, and it's getting more so. There is just an enormous value. Well, I will say it for a couple of reasons. One, youth sports for the last decade has been by far the largest growing segment of the tourism industry in the United States. It tends to be recession-proof, that when economies go bad, parents, particularly in youth sports, will make their family vacation wherever their children go to travel. They don't want to deprive. And in fact, in the last two major recessions, the one area of tourism that grew, the only area, was youth sports. And because of that, it creates more competition to host those events, and sometimes more dollars that communities have to put forth to try and attract those events. That leads to increased demands by events rights holders. So if you are an entity that owns these events, you know you have something that communities highly value, and oftentimes you will start asking for more, quite frankly, more money from a community to try and host the event. And it makes cities like ours more and more make significant value judgments of whether or not we want to host an event if we think there may not be the right return on investment because events rights holders are asking for too much. And it's why you see more and more privately owned events. In fact, a lot of venture capital and private equity dollars in the United States are getting behind sporting events and youth sports. Because it's a more crowded space, for us, we have to do more and more work to keep those events rights holders informed of why Cleveland, in our case, is a place that they want to host events as opposed to other cities. But what I will tell you is, we see for us that the future is very bright. The number of events that we host in our community continues to go up. The economic impact each year from outside spending continues to go up. We see more and more events that continue to come to us and say, we were very successful when we were in Cleveland. We hosted our event 2 years ago. We'd like to come there again next year, without having to put in a bid or compete against other cities. And finally, where we know for us, we believe the future is very bright, that we continue to receive significant support from our public, private, civic leaders as they see the return on investment on the hosting of these major events continues to be a significant growth area for our community. So I'll close there, and thank you very much again for having me, and appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.